So everybody, this is our next webinar of today. Due to we have this Nordic Baltic meeting, so we have some very skilled colleagues from the Nordic Baltic countries. And this time we have invited Bjørn Dahle from the Norwegian Beekeeper Association, who has been working with varroa resistance experiments in Norway over the last few years. I'm sure lots of you have been listening to me telling you that the Norwegians, they're treating less than we are. And now I think Bjørn, he will tell some of the secret behind what's going on in Norway. So, and everybody, please use the opportunity to make questions in the chat down on the right side in the on your window, and then I will write the questions down, and then I will ask Bjørn after his session. So Bjørn, please, thank you very much joining us and making this talk.
Thank you for this nice introduction. I'm very excited to come here and have the opportunity to talk about this exciting topic, varroa resistance, and what we have experienced in Norway. So first, just I would like to point out the difference between what we call varroa resistance, which relates to the mechanisms that either reduce the survival of the varroa mite or reduce its reproduction. That's a somewhat different what we call varroa tolerance, which is the mechanism that make the bees able to survive high infestation levels. So if you have surviving bees, you often have both these mechanisms in place. So why should we care about varroa resistance? Because we could say that, okay, just treat our bees with acaricides and they will be doing fine. In beekeeping, as in other parts of the agriculture, we would like to decrease the number of chemical treatment, and for us it will be reduce the number of times we have to treat against varroa mites during the season. So when we talk about varroa resistance, it could either mean that we have bees that are really resistant, so they don't need treatment at all, or we might have bees that need less treatments. As Flemming mentioned, we have some bees in Norway that survives with varroa mites. So we have been working now with beekeepers, actually a few beekeepers there, that stopped treating with acaricides back in 1997. So that's more than 20 years ago. This population we have been working with has what we call a mixed origin. It's partly Norwegian mellifera in there. There are some kind of Norwegian buckfast, and there's also some bees that have been imported from the United States some 15-20 years ago. So after stopping with treating for varroa mites, this beekeeper, he has been doing a selection mainly for survival and productivity. So he experienced some years after treatment that he had a really high infestation rate, and he also had a lot of clinical symptoms of deformed wing virus. This was also associated with quite high colony losses, but eventually, at least during the last 10 years, he has had low winter losses, and low in Norway means that he has lost less than 10% of the colonies. So just shortly about what we know about the resistance mechanisms in European honeybees. It could simply be divided into two main mechanisms. Either the bees could remove mites either from themselves or from their nestmates, in a process what we call grooming. Or worker bees, they could identify brood cells which are infested and open these brood cells and remove the infested pupa. That's a term what we call varroa sensitive hygienic behavior, or VSH. So I just will present some results from the study we have been doing in Norway. And when I say we have been so happy to have a PhD student, Melissa Oddi, from the University of Bern in Switzerland. She has been doing the fieldwork for her PhD thesis in Norway. So in last year, we published a paper about this Norwegian population. And in this study, we used what we call susceptible colonies, which actually is a control where we used colonies that has been treated annually and compare them with this population, what we call the surviving bees. So to measure the infestation level in these colonies, we used the natural mite fall on the bottom boards. And we found that actually in these colonies that has not been treated for 20 years, they had a lower number of mites falling down on the bottom board than the susceptible colonies that were treated annually. So they are surviving, and there must be some resistance mechanisms that keeps this mite level at a rather low level. We would like to investigate these different suggested mechanisms. So to see if grooming was part of the story, we collected the mites that were falling on the bottom board, and they were investigated to see if they were injured or damaged. We know that bees, when they remove mites from each other, they often bite these mites, and they could be injured they could be losing their legs and so on. Actually, what we found is that there was no difference in the proportion of mites that were damaged in the surviving colonies compared to the susceptible colonies. So we concluded that grooming is not an important part explaining the surviving of the Norwegian population. We also investigated this varroa sensitive hygienic behavior. And the way we did it was actually to use highly infested, what we call donor colonies, where we collected brood frames from these highly infested colonies and inserted these frames into the surviving colonies and into susceptible control colonies. We took pictures of these newly capped brood frames before we put them into these colonies and after or just before they were emerging. And what we used these pictures for was actually to see the proportion of brood cells that were opened and emptied. And we knew that these brood combs, they were highly infested. But actually, there was no difference in the proportion of brood cells that were opened in the surviving and the susceptible colonies. So again, we concluded BSH is not an important part of the story explaining the survival of the Norwegian population. We also measured the reproduction of the varroa mite. That's a quite time-consuming job. What we actually do is to open brood cells, and that we have to use brood cells that are pretty soon the bee will emerge. So we used old brood. And what we found is that the varroa mite has problems to reproduce in the surviving colonies. So the reproduction rate of the varroa mite is reduced by about 30% compared to the susceptible control colonies. So then the question was, what kind of mechanism could explain this reduced reproduction of varroa mite in the surviving bees? So we had a cooperation with a larger group in Europe. We had partners from France, who has been working with the two surviving population in France, and we also have cooperation with the Swedish colleagues who has been working with the Swedish Gotland bees that have been surviving the mites. So this study was published just a week ago. And this figure is just to illustrate the option the worker bees have when they identify an infested brood cell. They would then when they have identified infested brood cell, they could open this brood cells, and if they would like to do this VSH, they would actually remove the infested pupa. But they also have another option, actually just leave the cell open. And later they could actually recap this open cell. When we open these brood cells and turn this capping upside down, we could actually see whether this cell has been opened and closed again. You might see it in this figure. You know, the bee pupa has a cocoon around itself, and this cocoon is actually open when the bees open the cell, and we could see this as a hole in this wax cocoon. And this is a behavior that it's called recapping. It's not a new behavior. It has been described before, but it has not been really associated with varroa resistance and mite reproduction. So what we found in this Norwegian bees and also the other population was that the surviving bees, they open a much higher proportion of the brood cells, both a higher proportion of uninfested brood cells and especially infested brood cells. So this is the proportion of the cells that were opened by susceptible bees compared to the surviving bees. So they both open more brood cells and they are really targeting the infested ones. And we found the same pattern in all these four populations, which makes it really interesting. And these populations, they are not related at all. So this means that this behavior has been evolving 4 times independent of each other. We also made experiments to see what kind of effect this recapping or the removing of these caps have on the mite reproduction. So here we actually made an experiment where we removed the caps by using a cloth with melted wax, and then we can just tear off this cloth, and the caps will be removed. Afterwards, we could insert this brood frame into the colony again, and the bees will actually recap all the missing caps. So in this experiment, we opened or we removed the cappings of half of the frame, and we could afterwards measure the proportion of mites that did not reproduce, that were non-reproducing. What we found is that when we removed these caps, the mites had problems to reproduce successfully. So this is probably what's happened then when the bees identify infested cells, they open them, let them stay open for some time, and then recap them. And the nice thing with this mechanism compared to the varroa-sensitive hygienic behavior, where actually the bees open the cell and kick out the infested pupa, is that this recapping behavior is less costly because you don't throw away your sisters in doing it. We have been also investigated if there could be other factors contributing to the survival of these Norwegian bees. So we have been thinking, okay, these bees, which are resistant in Norway, most of these beekeepers keep these bees on what we call this small cell size wax foundation. Conventional beeswax usually has a size of the cells about 5.3 millimeters, whereas these beekeepers, they use smaller cells, about 4.9 millimeters. So there's been a lot of debate over the last 20 years, I guess, if this has an effect on mite reproduction and mite resistance. So we have been investigating this in this Norwegian population, but these results are not published yet, so I am not allowed to tell you the results from that. We have also been working to see whether these bees have a more rapid development. You see, if you're able to shorten the period the brood has as a capped brood, the mite will run out of time, because the mite has to reproduce really fast to be able to reach maturity before the bee emerge from the cell. So we've also made some experiments about this, but this also is results that we are on the way of publish. So I will better come back to these results on a later occasion. So I think I'll stop there. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you, Bjørn. I hope everybody can hear me out there. It was very, very interesting talk. I mean, from my short time in Norway, I know that something is going on up there. It's really amazing that you don't have to treat your colonies for a longer time. There's one question from Marianne and Mikkel. I'm not sure who is online here, but they call themselves Marianne and Mikkel, and they're asking you, do you do something specially? Are you testing the queens? Do you have in your breeding program? Do you have a testing set up? I know you have. Could you maybe explain shortly what you're actually doing with the Norwegian population and the Norwegian queen breeding?
Yeah, so this population we have been working with now, it's owned by a beekeeper, and there is also some other small-scale beekeepers having the same bees. So these bees are not belonging to the Norwegian Beekeeping Association. So we are running a selection program in the Beekeeping Association where we try to introduce varroa resistance as one of the selected traits, in line with honey production and gentleness and so on. Honestly, it's quite hard to have the beekeepers participating in this selection program, because selecting for varroa resistance also involves some extra effort from the beekeepers. So we are in the start of doing this. When it comes to this resistant population owned by this beekeeper, he has been doing his own selection. He has not been really counting mites, but he has more focused on which colonies do survive well and which colonies do build up strong colonies. That has been the basis for selection.
But now this is getting very, very exciting now. So so he did not do any type of counting. So it was really the survival of the fittest. The ones that died went out of the program, and the ones that survived, they were kept in. Is that really? Is it really as simple as that?
It is more or less as simple as that. And in Europe now we have several places where we have been starting what we call more selection program, where we actually don't rely on counting mites, but rather on measuring winter survival and colony buildup. They have done that now in the Netherlands, about 10 years. And in this way, actually, you don't lose colonies, because the colonies that do not survive or do not build up good in the spring, you take them out of the selection program and you could treat them, and you could use them as ordinary production colonies. So this is a more soft way of doing this selection compared to what they did on the Gotland Island with the bond bees.
Because if I can, I mean, the question was still, just to go back to Mikkel and Marianne's question is so how do you implement this into your, so you have this national breeding program of the Beekeeper Association. Are you going to implement some of your ideas into this breeding program? And maybe that would be my final question for you. What would you recommend us to do? You should answer that at the end when we finish. But really, what are you learning as a Beekeeper Association and for your breeding program? Because you're the guy responsible for the breeding, and we want to have tolerant bees.
Yeah. So for me, it's a problem, because Norwegian Beekeeping Association, we own the queens that are run in the program, but we do not own the colonies these queens are tested in. That belongs to the beekeepers. So that sets certain limits to what we are able to enforce the beekeepers to do or not to do when it comes to treatment and so on. And it's one thing it's obvious is that if we continue treating with acaricides, to just treat all colonies the same way, we will never ever reach resistance. Yeah, that's for sure. So if we would like to breed resistant bees, we actually need to see what colonies do better than the other ones.
So I just want to keep focusing on this, because I want to steal as much as possible from you. And it's, how do you measure this build up in the springtime? Is it kind of counting the number of bees, bee spaces, yeah, the amount of bees, let's say 1st of April, and then the amount of bees the 1st of May, and then you can see who is building up fast,
yeah. They're measuring the spring build-up.
How do they measure?
And yeah, it's actually counting the frames of bees and so on, and especially they are focusing on the colonies which are able to produce a lot of drones.
Okay.
Yeah. So if a colony runs into a problem, drones are the first one to get kicked out. Yeah. So it's especially focusing on drone production, the ability to rear drones.
Okay. That's very interesting, and it's very different from what has been done until now, because I know there has been breeding programs going on, I would say now for 20 years, more or less, for breeding for varroa tolerance. Great jobs, lots of investment, lots of time has been spent, and to be honest, they're not really moving. That's my personal. Could you comment on that? Does your new what you have shown here, does it show us that we have actually done things in the wrong way? Is that?
Yeah, it's a different. You could look at this at different angles, and what they have done in the Netherlands now, they have done the selection based on survival and productivity and production of drones, colony buildup, and so on. They have also counted mites, but they have not used the mite counts as a selection criteria.
Okay.
But they see that the colonies that do survive good, that do build up strong colonies, that do produce drone brood, they also have the lowest mite number. But it's probably easier to get the beekeepers to run a selection for these traits than do all these mite countings or do test of hygienic behavior and so on, which is really time consuming, and beekeeper doesn't like it. That's for sure. It's really hard to get the beekeepers to do this pin test or freezing test or whatever you call it. So it's a different perspective, but you should also keep in mind that in this breeding program, for example, in Germany, they are selecting for a lot of traits at the same time. They would like to have gentle bees, you should have productive bees, the bees should not be swarmy, and so on. And the more trait you select for, the harder it is to really reach the goal for each of them.
Yeah, so that's really what we are forgetting in this discussion. We're so focused on you could say, varroa tolerance. We have to say that if you take the bees on Gotland, I think that they are tolerant, pretty aggressive, not really good honey collectors. So this is a kind of a paradox in the whole discussion, I would say.
Yeah. So it's if you only keep one thing in your mind, if you only select for varroa resistant, you will probably get bees that are resistant, but perhaps not very useful for commercial
So maybe
beekeepers.
you're actually answering Ole West Nielsen's question right now. He says, would we have any limitation in Denmark when we were using your program? And that's maybe that's what you're telling us right now. We could use it, but
Yeah, you could easily lose some other
yeah,
other traits if you really do a
yeah,
strong selection
yeah,
of one of them. You will often lose
okay.
something else.
I I I like your graphic. Could you go back to that graphic showing all the different populations? Is it possible to go back there? Those
Yep.
ones there. So we have the one in France. As far as I know, it's a wild population. Isn't it kind of, they ask the beekeepers, do you know of surviving colonies out there? Maybe they have been in a chimney or something like that, that you can kind of can prove that they have been surviving for many years. And as far
Yeah.
as I
Yeah.
remember, I know is that they went out there and they got the colonies and they put them into an apiary and they were extremely aggressive and so on. If we take the same with,
Yep.
I don't know the other, maybe that's the two places in France, and then we
Yes,
have the
it's
Sweden
two
population is
persons.
really the Scotland thing where they
Yeah.
left the bees out there that did something, but they left them, and that was really the surviving were back. So that makes sense for me.
Yep.
They're aggressive and maybe not so good honey collectors.
Yeah, actually, the Swedish
Okay,
bees are not
sorry.
aggressive. Yeah, but they do not build
Okay.
strong colonies.
But
No,
it's
they
really
don't.
the Norwegian one is a very very different population because there has been done breeding on them. So how has he been
Yeah,
able to make tolerant bees as a normal green breeder, bee breeder? What's the secret? What's the and you and I, since we know him,
yeah,
he has been believing in other explanations also during that time. Can you comment a bit about
yeah,
that? Is it?
yeah. It's because it's this population has then been under selection now for 20 years, which is a quite
Mm,
long period. So according to the beekeeper, he had quite high losses the first years. So there was probably a quite strong selection
mm,
for survival. Um, and he has also made quite many different
mm,
smaller experiments. We have
mm,
also been
mm,
counting a lot of mites. He has also been challenging these bees with this black ants, just to see how the bees react to these ants. And some colonies they don't care about the ants, and other colonies they are
mm,
really chasing them away. So he has been doing a lot of
mm.
different smaller experiments and probably made some
Okay.
selection out of that
So
as well.
it might actually
Yeah,
be that he has been selecting for something that he didn't know. So it's
yeah,
lucky
yeah,
punch
and of
kind of,
course
you
it
could say.
uh, yeah, and when you do this selection,
Mm,
you don't know the mechanisms, but actually the mechanism is not the most
yeah.
important thing as long as it works.
Yeah, of course.
And what we find special here is that we find the same mechanism
Mm,
in
mm,
four independent populations
yeah, yeah.
across Europe, and that points in the direction that okay, this is a could be an important trait, and it's what is also important to see is that all population, also the susceptible population, control population in this study, also have the behavior. So it's a behavior, it's already there, it only has to be improved. So you're not
Mm,
developing a new
mm,
behavior, you're
mm.
just improving it.
I had this question. Yeah, you were kind of looking on this what we call the grooming behavior, and you were looking on the insert, and then you were looking on
Yeah.
Were the mites damaged? And you couldn't find any damaged mites. But is that the same? I mean,
Or
grooming for me is I'm a bee. I go to one of the other bees. There's a mite. I take the mite off and kind of kick it down. Is grooming really that you I go and find that mite and then I have to kind of bite it, kill it, or is that the exact definition of grooming?
it's hard to say. It could be used as an indication of grooming. If the mite is injured,
Okay.
we use it as an indication
Mm.
of grooming. There might very well be that mites are kicked
Yeah.
off without being injured. It might happen, yes, of course. But I think
Okay.
the mite will often be injured in this process. And as we didn't find any difference at all between the surviving bees and the susceptible bees, I really doubt that grooming could be an
And then
important
maybe we could speculate.
factor.
I mean, I don't know, philosophically or something like that. I mean, your bees, it's not your bees, but the bees that you have made surveys on is actually they're clever. They just go there, they open up the lid of the bees, and then you have to explain this a little bit more. That means as soon as it's opened up, the mites are not able to multiply itself anymore. Is it kind of that you open the door and then they stop multiplying? That's the explanation. Can you
That's more or less the
is
explanation,
there
yes.
more
Yeah.
explanation? I mean, how long time does it have to be open?
Usually it's close to
Okay,
within a few hours.
so just opening up, I
Yeah.
kind of block the life cycle of the varroa mite.
Yeah. So there's some kind of disturbance that might. Yeah. And it's not the way that the mite is not able to reproduce, but it
Okay,
has a
so could be
reduced
10%,
reproduction.
20% or something like that.
Yeah. What we found here is about a 30% reduction. And one important thing that we have been also studying this French population and the Swedish one and the Norwegian one in a larger test where we test these population in different locations in Europe. And what we experience there is when we have these colonies set up in the different locations in Europe in the same apiary, all colonies will have problems with mites, also what we define
Ah,
as surviving colonies. And that means that if you have a surviving colony and you put it into an apiary with susceptible colonies, this difference in mite reproduction that we found is really overruled by by the by robbing and so on. So actually, if you would like to have a survive or resistant apiary, you should actually be
everything.
quite far away from the susceptible ones to really
Which
be
was
resistant. Otherwise, this redistribution of mites in the apiary will actually overrule this difference we
and
find in mite
which I think
reproduction.
is the case in Norway because you have the very low density of bees there. I mean, we talk about this beekeeper, but I also met other beekeepers up there that I mean they did treat, but they did compared to to Danish conditions really not treat. I mean, maybe they made it oxalic acid trickling maybe every second year or something like that, and that could really be
Yeah,
because the
yeah,
density of the bees is so low, so there's really no reinvasion aspect into this.
yeah. So that's for sure is an important part of it because I think it's easier to breed resistant bees in Norway than it is further south in Europe, both because we have a lower density of both colonies and apiaries, and we also have a shorter brood rearing season. So
So the story is
it's
actually
several
I should
factors
not
that
go to
contribute to
Norway and
this.
buy queens from this queen breeder and then expect that I will have tolerance in my apiaries just around the corner here. Yeah, okay,
I think you will
that's
run
what we
into
see
problem.
actually all over.
Mm.
Okay, great. We're getting to the end of this. So if there's any more questions out there, please, it's time now for writing those. Otherwise, I want to really ask Bjørn, what is the conclusion of this? What is going to be the advice for the beekeepers in general, and maybe for the queen breeders, just in general terms?
Mm. I think it's we should not expect that we will have resistant bees all over. That's a fantasy. Yeah. So what we might expect is that if we do the job, we might have less susceptible bees that might be able to survive with one treatment a year or something, or we could be better prepared for a longer brood rearing season. We might be experiencing in just a few decades, we might have brood all year round. We will have the situation that they have in southern Germany now, where they spend most of summer actually just fighting mites. And if we have colonies that are less susceptible, we might continue using the strategy we do now, or we have to change strategy and treat really even more.
I would say the conclusion of beekeeping at the moment is that we have very good methods to treat for varroa mites, but at least for Denmark, there's a tendency then that we are kind of introducing one more treatment, and we should really work for removing treatments over the years. I mean, it's not fun to treat anyway if you're doing it in the organic way, or if you're using, I mean, hard chemicals in the colonies as well.
Yeah.
Okay. There's no more questions out there, so I think it has been a good talk and maybe a very good discussion between you and me. So thank you very much for sharing this with us, and please be on. We will start with the next talk about pollen, 5 o'clock. So be back in 20 minutes. Thank you very much, everybody.